Just a shelf stocker. That's what Gerald Hawkins whispered to the regional district manager on the phone at 11:22 p.m., 3 minutes after he realized Danielle Ross had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. She's asking questions about inventory counts. He didn't know her hands had held Ranger's intestines together in Sanjin while IED shrapnel sang through the air around them. He didn't know the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, hanging in her employee locker under her spare vest, had been cut from the uniform of a man she'd carried for kilometers under fire while his femur bled out. He didn't know that in 7 hours, he would post a disciplinary notice that would begin the unraveling of everything. But first, there was the cereal aisle. There was always the cereal aisle. The Navy Exchange grocery store in San Diego smelled like industrial disinfectant and the hollow fluorescence of noon. Danielle Ross moved between the shelves with a kind of invisible competence that made people forget she was working. Shoulders hunched slightly forward. Blue vest faded almost to gray. Name tag reading simply Danielle because there was no rank here, no insignia, no proof of the life that existed in the space between the woman in scrubs and the woman in the vest. Her hands placed boxes of cereal on the shelf, Raisin Bran, Special K, Honey Nut Cheerios, each one positioned with the same precision she'd once used counting ammunition rounds in the dark of a forward operating base. Left to right. Aligned. No mistakes. Muscle memory didn't care that it was been 13 years. Muscle memory never forgot. It was 12:34 p.m. when she noticed the dairy delivery was short. The loading dock was loud with the sound of a refrigerated truck backing away, its hydraulic whine echoing through the receiving area. Danielle had been in the cooler, checking inventory against the manifest, when she registered the discrepancy. 30 cases of 2% milk. Gone. The paperwork said they'd arrived. Her eyes said they hadn't. Her hands, those same steady hands that had performed needle decompression on a corporal with a tension pneumothorax while the corporal's lung collapsed, her hands began recounting the pallets without being told to. The numbers didn't change. She found Assistant Manager Trevor Chen stacking boxes near the loading dock, and she kept her voice low. Quiet. The way people talk when they're not sure if they have permission to speak. Trevor, we're short on the 2% dairy. 30 cases. Trevor looked up. He was good at his job, conscientious in the way of men who wanted to make shift supervisor by next fiscal year. Short how? The manifest says 47 cases. I count 17. That's... Trevor's eyes widened slightly. That's a major variance. Where's the invoice? Danielle didn't say anything for a moment. Behind them, in the narrow space between the receiving door and the storage racks, she could hear Gerald Hawkins shifting his weight. He'd been standing there for 9 seconds, she'd counted, with a clipboard he wasn't using, pretending to check something on the far wall. She'd learned to hear people who were listening. That was a useful skill. That was also, perhaps, a skill she should have kept buried. The invoice is here, she said, still quiet. But the merchandise isn't. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hawkins stepped around the corner. Gerald Hawkins was the kind of man whose suits never quite fit right because they cost too much and meant nothing. His tie was the color of money, not actual money, but the color money wanted people to think about when they wore it. His name tag said manager, and he'd arranged his face into the expression of a man who had just arrived and was utterly surprised to be standing here. Everything all right? His voice came out smooth, like gravel under a tire. Dairy discrepancy, Trevor said. 30 cases short. Hawkins's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Then he smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. It was the kind of smile that went as far as his teeth and stopped there, like a shark's. I'll look into it, he said. Trevor, you're good. These things happen. Danielle, let's get back to the shelves, yeah. It wasn't a question. She nodded and turned away, her vest whispering against her body as she moved. Behind her, she heard Hawkins's voice drop to something softer. A conversation that wasn't meant to be heard. She heard her own name. She heard the words asking questions and could be a problem. She didn't hear the rest because professional distance required that she not stand still, not listen, not confirm that she'd already seen exactly what he didn't want her to see. She had learned not to flinch. That was perhaps the most useful skill of all. The cereal aisle was empty when she returned to it. The store's lighting was the kind that made everyone look vaguely unwell, fluorescent tubes humming with the sound of electricity trying to hold back darkness. Danielle began restocking, her movements methodical, her mind doing two things at once, the careful work of shelf placement and the automatic calculation of exactly how many people knew about the dairy variants. One assistant manager. One store manager. Maybe a regional representative by the time her shift ended. Maybe corporate. Maybe no one, if Hawkins moved fast enough to make it disappear. She had learned not to be surprised when people chose themselves over everyone else. The morning had started like most mornings. She'd woken at 4:06 a.m. without an alarm, her internal clock set from years of waking in the dark before the sun could turn you into a target. She'd made coffee. Black, no sugar. She'd looked at her jacket hanging on the back of her bedroom door, the one with the patch sewn inside the lining, the one she hadn't worn in public since 2014. Then she'd put on the blue vest and drove to the Navy Exchange because the bills didn't pay themselves and her 14-year-old son needed dental work his insurance wouldn't cover. By 2:15 p.m., she was in the parking lot. The elderly veteran had come into the store around 1:48 p.m., moving slowly, dragging a rolling oxygen tank behind him like a metal companion that had become part of his body. He was maybe 75, with white hair that hadn't seen a barber in weeks and a face that had seen more than the eyes wanted to remember. His VA benefits shirt bore the insignia of someone who had carried a rifle once, though the shirt was faded now, the ink ghosted into paleness by time and 1,000 laundries. His name tag, a handwritten label someone had stuck on his shirt, read, Colin. She'd seen him twice before. Both times she'd noticed the way he struggled with the oxygen tank, the way his hand shook slightly when he reached for items on the higher shelves. The way his eyes had that particular glassiness that came from medication, from pain, from the slow process of a body deciding it didn't want to keep working. When she saw him collapse near the self-checkout, her body had moved before her mind caught up. That was muscle memory too. But it wasn't a collapse. It was just difficulty. His oxygen tank had slipped when he'd turned, and he'd stumbled, catching himself on the register counter. His hand was shaking. His breathing was labored. He was trying to right the oxygen tank, but the angle was wrong, and his body, whatever service had cost him, wasn't moving the way he wanted it to move anymore. Here. Danielle was beside him instantly, steadying the tank. Let me. I got it, he said, but his voice was thin as paper. You don't. She repositioned the tank, checked the regulator, made sure the nasal cannula was positioned correctly. The plastic tube was old, slightly discolored. The tank's gauge showed 3/4 full. You're good. You're fine. His eyes focused on her name tag. She watched something flicker there, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of recognition. His mouth opened as if to say something, and then the moment passed. The dementia or the medication or the simple wear of age pulled whatever thread he'd almost caught back down into fog. Thank you, he said. I'm walking you to your car, she told him. It wasn't a question. The parking lot was hot, the kind of heat that came off asphalt like a physical thing. Her blue vest was sticking to her back. Colin's car was a 2009 Prius, pale blue, parked in the back corner near the loading area. She held the oxygen tank steady as they walked, matching his pace, not urging him faster. He moved like someone learning to walk again. When they reached his car, she opened the passenger door first, set the oxygen tank on the seat where he could reach it easily, then opened the driver's door. He settled into the seat with a sigh that sounded like resignation. You come here often, she asked. Thursdays mostly. Routine helps. He looked at her again, and again there was that flicker. Do I know you from somewhere? I work here, she said simply. I restock shelves. No, it's... He trailed off, his hand moving to his forearm. He lifted his sleeve, and Danielle saw the tattoo. It was old, the ink faded to a blue-gray, done by someone who wasn't particularly skilled. It read Ross in block letters. Below it was a date. 2011. She didn't move. She didn't tremor or flush or make any of the small sounds that bodies made when they recognized something true. She just looked at the tattoo, at her own last name, written on a stranger's arm by whoever she'd been in Sanjin when this man had been someone worth that kind of memory. Sanjin, he said quietly, as if testing the word. I was in Sanjin. With rangers. There was a medic there. I can't quite. He shook his head, frustrated. The memory's not what it was. It will come back to you, Danielle said, and it was absolutely not a lie because she wasn't sure if she believed it. Thank you for your service. You. He looked at her name tag. Danielle. She didn't answer. She just steadied his hand on the steering wheel, made sure his oxygen was secure, and closed the car door. She watched him drive away, his Prius pulling out slowly into the afternoon, and then she stood alone in the parking lot while the heat and the sun and 13 years pressed down on her shoulders. When she got back inside, Gerald Hawkins was on the phone in his office. She could see him through the glass partition, his face red, his voice a low urgent hiss. He was talking about liability and medical procedures and immediate action. She didn't stay to listen. She went back to the cereal aisle, where the boxes were waiting to be aligned, where nothing was ever out of place, where she could pretend to be invisible and perhaps, if she was very quiet, make it true. It wasn't going to be true. But that wasn't the worst part yet. That would come in the morning. The dairy delivery count didn't match the invoice. Danielle had noticed it 3 days ago, 48 cases logged, but only 32 stacked on the shelf. She'd mentioned it quietly to the assistant manager, Marcus, just a soft observation while they reviewed the morning manifest. The numbers are off on the dairy order, she'd said. Nothing accusatory. Just data. Marcus had nodded, made a note, moved on. But Gerald Hawkins had been standing in the stockroom doorway when she said it. She'd seen his jaw tighten. Seen the color drain from his face for exactly 2 seconds before he turned and walked back to his office without a word. Danielle had kept restocking. She didn't know that Hawkins had built a 17-month operation around vendor contracts, inflating the quantities on invoices, pocketing the difference when suppliers never delivered what the paperwork claimed. For suppliers, $3,000 a week. $56,000 since March. Money that moved through a personal account she'd never find, money that funded his daughter's tuition and the down payment on his second house in Escondido. One observant woman mentioning a discrepancy in the dairy order wasn't just a comment. It was a fuse. The next morning, Danielle arrived for the 6 o'clock shift and saw the employee board by the time clock. White paper. Black printed text. A red exclamation mark at the top. Danielle Ross, unauthorized personnel area access, final warning. The word sat under the fluorescent lights like a verdict. Her hands went still. She read it twice to make sure she hadn't misread it. Unauthorized personnel area access. She'd never set foot in a restricted area. She didn't even know what that meant. The morning crew filtered in behind her. Checkout clerk Teresa. Stock associate Miguel. Old Mr. Chen, who'd worked the Navy Exchange for 23 years and usually smiled when he saw her. They all stopped. They all read it. Their eyes moved from the notice to her face and back again. The room went dead silent. That's new, Miguel said quietly, his voice careful. Danielle took one measured breath. Pulled the notice from the board and read the back. It was signed by Gerald Hawkins, store manager, dated yesterday at 6:51 p.m. No details. No explanation. Just the accusation and his signature. She pinned it back to the board. You know what? Teresa said, too loudly. I'm going to grab coffee before we start. She was already moving toward the break room. Miguel followed. Mr. Chen hesitated, his weathered face caught between kindness and self-preservation, then he shuffled after them. Danielle started her shift. By 9 a.m., Hawkins emerged from his office and positioned himself by the cereal aisle where the morning crew was working. His voice carried the kind of deliberate loudness that wasn't actually directed at the merchandise. "Some people," he said, speaking to no one in particular, "seem to think the store rules don't apply to them. That they can wander into restricted inventory areas whenever they please. That's not how we operate. We have protocols for a reason. We have security measures. We have systems that keep us all safe and compliant." He was looking at a display of Cheerios. But everyone knew. Danielle shelved cereal boxes, one after another. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was clenched, but it was the clench of someone working, not someone breaking. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't look at him. Didn't flinch when he walked past close enough that she heard his breathing. He smiled at that. At her composure. At the fact that his verbal blade hadn't drawn blood in front of witnesses. Around 2 o'clock, Hawkins called her into his office. The room smelled like stale coffee and the leather chair that cost more than her monthly rent. He was sitting behind his desk, very composed, very official. "I'm reassigning you," he said. "Effective immediately. You'll be moving to the graveyard shift. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 5 days a week. I think the reduced interaction with the main crew will be better for everyone's peace of mind during this investigation." "What investigation?" Her voice was even. Controlled. The voice of someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear him say it aloud. The one into inventory discrepancies and missing stock. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Certain employees had access to restricted areas. "We have to be thorough. It's corporate protocol. I never accessed a restricted area." "That's what they all say, Danielle." He smiled. His teeth were too white. Too clean. A predator's smile. Unless the graveyard shift is too difficult for someone with your limitations. There it was. The real message. Not an investigation. A trap. A slow suffocation. Work nights alone, isolated from the crew, until you quit on your own. She stood up. "I'll work the shift." "Good. That's very mature of you." She turned for the door. "By the way," he called out, "I may have mentioned to a few people that there's a theft investigation. Not naming names, of course. But certain employees had access. Certain employees were suddenly very interested in inventory counts. People talk. They worry. They protect themselves. You understand." Danielle stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, steady and mechanical, like a metronome designed by someone who'd been in worse rooms than this. She turned back. Met his eyes across the desk. The silence lasted 3 seconds. "I've survived worse than your insecurity, Mr. Hawkins." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. No anger. No defensiveness. Just a statement of fact delivered by someone who had literally walked through enemy fire in Sanjin, Helmand Province, carrying wounded rangers on her shoulders while bullets punched through walls around her. His smile froze. She saw it. The way his eyes went small. The way his hand moved toward his coffee cup and stopped mid-motion. He'd expected her to cry or argue or beg for clarification. Instead, she'd looked at him like she was seeing through him, seeing past him, to something so much smaller than his own sense of importance. A single tear escaped her eye. Not from sadness. Not from fear. From the pressure of 12 years of carrying things, lives and secrets and memories and the weight of names she couldn't speak aloud, and never once letting anyone see the effort it took. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Then she walked out of his office and back to the cereal aisle. The thing about rumors is they spread like vapor through ventilation systems. By lunch, the break room had shifted. Maria, who'd worked checkout for 6 years and actually liked Danielle, gathered her sandwich without looking at her. Mr. Chen pretended to need something from the stockroom when Danielle sat down at the usual table. Tech, the assistant stock supervisor, took his drink to the far end of the room. Danielle heard Hawkins's voice in the hallway, pitched just loud enough to carry through the break room door. "I'm not saying anything definitive," he was telling someone, probably Marcus, the assistant manager. "But there's an investigation into inventory theft. Certain employees had unusual access. I've already recommended reassignment to minimize further complications. Corporate will probably want to interview people. It's standard procedure. You just have to protect yourself in these situations." The message was surgically precise. She wasn't being accused of anything. She was being examined in front of witnesses while remaining technically blameless. A reputation dismantled through implication. Maria still wouldn't look at her. That night, after the graveyard shift ended at 6 in the morning, Danielle drove home through San Diego traffic that moved like blood through veins, inevitable and automated. Her apartment was quiet. Her 14-year-old son, Marcus Jr., was still asleep, his backpack by the door for school. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. There was a folder in her hands. Cream-colored. Stamped with dates. The pages inside were almost entirely redacted, thick black marker obscuring everything except a few words and an official seal. DDL 214. Discharge paperwork. The official documentation of a military career that the Pentagon had decided should cease to exist in any meaningful way. Her son appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair messy from sleep, still wearing the t-shirt he'd slept in. "Mom? You just got home." She closed the folder quickly. Slid it under a newspaper on the table. "Graveyard shift," she said. "I'm going to sleep for a few hours before work tonight." "That's crazy. You've been working since yesterday morning." "I know." Marcus Jr. sat down across from her. He was 14, with his father's dark eyes and Danielle's exact composure, the kind of kid who didn't ask a lot of questions because he'd learned early that some answers didn't come easily. "Did something happen?" he asked. "You look different." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're quiet fine." "That's different." She reached across the table and touched his hand. His fingers were already longer than hers, the hands of someone who would be taller than her within a year. "I promise you everything is fine. I just need to sleep." But that wasn't the worst part. That would come in 3 days, during the graveyard shift, when an elderly man with a breathing problem would collapse in aisle 7, and Danielle would be the only person qualified to save his life, and she would do it anyway, knowing exactly what it would cost her. 3 days into the graveyard shift, Danielle restocked the cereal aisle at 6:17 a.m. when she heard the sound. Not a crash. Not a yell. The absence of sound. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless drone, but underneath that, nothing. No footsteps. No shopping carts. No breathing from the produce section. She knew that silence. She'd heard it before in Sanjin. The elderly veteran lay collapsed in aisle 7, his body twisted at an angle that suggested he'd been reaching for something on the lower shelf when gravity had won. His name tag read Colin Price, retired. His chest wasn't moving right. It pulled inward with each attempted breath, the skin between his ribs drawing in like someone was vacuuming his lungs from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung with nowhere for the air to go except deeper into the chest cavity, compressing the heart, suffocating him from within. Danielle was moving before her conscious mind had caught up with her training. Her legs carried her across 12 feet of linoleum in 1.3 seconds. She dropped to her knees beside him, her practiced eyes already scanning, distended neck veins, the panicked flutter in his throat, skin the color of old cement. His mouth opened like a fish pulled from water, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Sir. Colin. Look at me." Her voice dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. His eyes found hers and something flickered behind the confusion. Recognition, maybe. Or just the drowning instinct to grab anything stable. Hawkins appeared from behind the customer service counter, his face already flushed with the anticipation of liability. Everyone step back. Don't touch him. We have a protocol for this. Paramedics are being called right now. Don't anybody, his voice climbed higher, touch anything. This is a medical emergency. We are not equipped. Danielle wasn't listening. Her hands moved on their own, the muscle memory of 18 years overriding 18 months of grocery store restocking. She scanned the immediate area. Pen. She needed a pen. Hollow. Had to be hollow. There. The checkout counter 30 feet away. But Colin's oxygen saturation was dropping. She could see it in the way his lips were starting to blue. The way his body was shutting down in real time, oxygen starving the brain, the heart, everything. 70 seconds. Maybe 90 before unconsciousness. Maybe 120 before death. She grabbed a ballpoint from the floor, someone's abandoned shopping list pen, snapped off the plastic tip, bit out the ink cartridge. The plastic barrel sat hollow in her palm, exactly what she needed. What are you doing? A voice. One of the overnight stock crew. Young. Frightened. Danielle didn't answer. There was no time for conversation. There was only anatomy and physiology and the second intercostal space between Colin's ribs where the trapped air was crushing his chest like a fist. She found the spot with her left hand, her fingers identifying the landmarks with a precision that felt like reading Braille. Second rib. Space below. Midclavicular line. Her right hand positioned the hollow pen like a scalpel. The plastic was thin. It would puncture. It had to puncture. You can't do that, Hawkins said from somewhere behind her, but his voice was distant now, operating in a different universe than the one where Colin was dying. That's unauthorized medical. The pen went in. The skin resistance was immediate, tough, resilient, exactly what she'd expected. She pushed through the fascia layer, then the pleural membrane, and then the hiss. It was the sound of pressure releasing, of trapped air escaping through a channel it never had before. That one hiss meant survival. Meant the compressed lung could expand. Meant the heart could beat without being crushed. Colin's chest expanded with a gasping, desperate breath. Then another. His color started shifting from cement gray toward something closer to human. His eyes stopped that drowning panic and locked back onto hers with something like comprehension. Easy, she said quietly. You're okay. The pressure's gone. You can breathe now. She kept her fingers on the pen barrel, monitoring his breathing, her other hand finding his wrist to check his pulse. It was hammering, tachycardia, expected, appropriate given what his body had just endured, but it was there. Strong. Getting stronger. 60 seconds had passed. Maybe 70. She'd done the procedure in 90. The exact timeline didn't matter anymore. What mattered was Colin Price was breathing. You saved him, a voice whispered. Danielle turned slightly. A man in his 50s, military bearing, his face destroyed by something between grief and shock. Colin's family. Of course Colin's family was here. Of course they'd seen the whole thing. She nodded once and returned her attention to Colin. Vitals. Breathing pattern. Responsiveness. Her hands moved with the economic efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, in forward operating bases, in helicopters, in the dark with rounds coming in and her patient bleeding into the sand. Through the glass partition of Hawkins's office, she could see him pacing, his phone pressed against his ear, his free hand gesticulating with the frantic energy of a man whose entire operation was collapsing in real time. I need this escalated to corporate immediately, she heard through the glass. Unqualified employee. Performing unauthorized medical procedures. Massive legal exposure. She's not licensed, she's not qualified, I want her terminated today. Today. Before end of shift. Danielle didn't look at him. She kept her attention on Colin, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the color returning to his face like watercolor blooming into linen. When paramedics arrived, sirens wailing, boots on tile, the organized chaos of professional responders, they found her already positioned to brief them. 34-year-old male, presents with acute dyspnea, distended JVD, unilateral breath sounds, she reported in the clipped precision of someone who'd been trained in a system where seconds cost lives. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression performed approximately 90 seconds ago, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, hollow pen. Immediate improvement in breathing. Current vital stable but tachycardic. The paramedics exchanged a glance. One of them, a woman with lieutenant's bars on her collar, looked directly at Danielle. "You a nurse?" Danielle hesitated. Half a second. That was all. Just long enough for the lie to assemble itself in her mouth, to prepare to walk out into the world wearing the right credentials, the safe credentials, the civilian credentials. "Yes," she said. They moved Colin onto the stretcher, reassessing his vitals, running an EKG, getting him prepped for transport to Mercy General's trauma unit. The family followed, the man in his 50s pausing to look back at Danielle one more time, a look that was complicated, searching, like he was trying to read something written in a language he almost recognized. Then they were gone. The ambulance doors closed. The sirens faded. And Danielle was standing alone in aisle 7 of the Navy Exchange grocery store in San Diego, her hand still trembling with the residual electricity of crisis response, the ballpoint pen cap sitting on the linoleum floor like evidence. By noon, they came. 2 men in Navy Exchange polo shirts, their walking pattern suggesting law enforcement training, their eyes already skeptical. Corporate investigators. They had questions about her credentials, her nursing license, her background clearance. They sat across from her in the break room while she stared at a cup of cold coffee and gave answers that were technically true but fundamentally incomplete. "Your employment records show you started here 18 months ago," one of them said, tapping a folder against the plastic table. "Before that, we have a gap. 18 months of nothing. No employment history, no tax records, no." "I can't explain that," Danielle said quietly. "Can't or won't?" "Both." Hawkins had made calls. She could trace the mechanism of her destruction like following a river back to its source. He'd called the regional director. He'd called district managers in Los Angeles and Coronado. He'd activated every contact in his network, every favor he'd accumulated, every person who owed him something or feared him enough to do what he wanted. The story spread like contamination, the unauthorized medical procedure, the liability, the unqualified employee operating outside her scope of practice, the potential lawsuit if Colin Price had complications, the risk exposure to military installations. At 2:17 p.m., a security officer she'd never seen before appeared at her locker while she was gathering her jacket. The one with the patch. "You're terminated," he said, not unkindly. His voice had the weariness of someone who'd been asked to do this many times before. "Your keycard is deactivated. You're not to return to Navy Exchange property. You understand?" She understood. The walk to the parking lot was long. Longer than she remembered. Her car was a 2009 Honda Civic, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who wanted to be invisible. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the afternoon sun falling across her lap while shoppers passed in and out of the automated doors, none of them knowing that the woman sitting motionless in a parking lot had just saved a life and lost her job in the same 90-second span. Her phone had no messages. No calls from corporate apologizing. No recognition, no medal, no official acknowledgement that she'd done anything remarkable at all. Just the regular silence of a life that had learned long ago not to expect applause. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part would come 3 hours later, when her 14-year-old son came home from school and found her sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at her hands, whispering something over and over that he couldn't quite make out. Something about surfacing. Something about staying deep. By noon, Hawkins was on the phone with his contact at the regional board. His voice carried that particular pitch of a man protecting his empire. We have an unqualified employee performing unauthorized medical procedures. Navy exchange policy explicitly forbids civilian intervention in medical emergencies. I'm demanding immediate termination for liability exposure. He listened to the response, then, by end of business today. Non-negotiable. The call lasted for minutes. In those 4 minutes, Danielle's fate shifted from uncertain to sealed. Corporate investigators arrived at 1:36 p.m. 2 of them. They wore business casual that screamed federal, navy blazers, hard eyes, tablets with her personnel file already open. Hawkins led them to the back office with the satisfied expression of a man who had successfully delegated his problem upward. They sat across from Danielle at a folding table meant for break room lunches, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly yellow that made her look smaller than she was. "Your nursing credentials," one investigator said. "Not a question." Danielle didn't move. Her hands lay flat on the table. "On file. We need verification. License number. State of certification. Current continuing education hours." The investigator's pen hovered. "Your records show employment as a shelf stocker. Not a medical professional. Yet you performed an advanced procedure on a customer yesterday morning." "I rendered aid to a person in cardiac distress," Danielle said. "That's not unauthorized. That's legal under the Good Samaritan statute in California." The second investigator leaned forward. She had the kind of face that had broken bad news to families. "Your name appears in no nursing database. No California medical licensure. No DEA registration for controlled substances. Your social security number matches employment records, but nothing beyond that. It's like you don't exist as a medical professional." The words hit the air like shrapnel. She didn't exist. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass, and Danielle felt something in her chest tighten, not fear. Recognition. She had been erased once already, in a file room at JSOC after an operation in Sanjin that had gone sideways in ways that required paperwork to disappear and names to vanish. They had remade her into nothing. They had done it with the competence of people who did it regularly. "I rendered first aid," Danielle repeated. "Nothing more." "First aid doesn't include needle decompression," the investigator said. "That requires medical credentials. Advanced cardiac life support certification. Which you don't have. Not in any system we can access." Hawkins appeared in the doorway, right on cue, his presence settling over the room like cold water. "As you can see, she misrepresented her qualifications. I've been operating in good faith, unaware that I employed someone without basic medical training. The liability alone." "We'll determine that," the first investigator said. She stood. Danielle remained seated, her hand still flat on the table, her spine against the chair. The investigator made a note on her tablet. "Ms. Ross, you're being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending review of the incident and verification of your background. Do not return to Navy Exchange property until notified." Hawkins's phone rang. He answered it while walking out, already talking to someone about district manager contacts who needed to be called. Danielle understood. He was building a firewall, a network of people who would nod when his story reached them, who would ensure that no other military exchange would touch her. Blacklisting didn't require meetings or documentation. It required phone calls and whispered conversations among people who trusted each other's judgment. Security arrived at 2:15 p.m. Not to remove her physically, but to walk her to her car with the specificity of ritual. The guard was young, uncomfortable, paid to enforce someone else's decision. Danielle followed him through the store past the aisles where she'd restocked for months, past the freezer cases where she'd found the elderly veteran struggling, past the customer service counter where she'd checked inventory discrepancies that should have stayed silent. The automatic doors hissed open. The afternoon sun hit her face like judgment. "You're not to return," the guard said. It wasn't hostility. It was procedure. "Your final paycheck will be mailed. Don't attempt to contact staff or customers." She didn't respond. She walked to her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with a check engine light that had been on for 8 months, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands gripped the wheel. Her breathing was controlled. Her face was a locked door. The drive home took 17 minutes. She spent those 17 minutes constructing a narrative she could tell her 14-year-old son. A story about budget cuts. About the store downsizing. About decisions made at the corporate level that had nothing to do with her performance. It was the same lie she'd constructed 1,000 times before, the lie that allowed her to survive in a world that couldn't know what she'd survived. Her son was at school until 3:38 p.m. She had time. She had exactly 1 hour before he walked through the door with his backpack and his questions and his ability to see through every defense she'd built. She sat at the kitchen table at 4 p.m., 3 hours before her graveyard shift would have begun. The termination letter lay in front of her on the worn pine table, the Navy Exchange letterhead, official and brutal, immediate dismissal for unauthorized medical intervention and credential misrepresentation. She read it twice. The second time, her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something older. From the knowledge that the carefully constructed Danielle Ross, the quiet nurse, the shelf stocker, the woman who had learned to be invisible, was collapsing. The woman underneath was surfacing, and surfacing meant exposure. Surfacing meant the record she'd erased might be unburied. It meant the rank she'd buried might be spoken aloud. It meant Sanjin might follow her here, to a kitchen table in San Diego, where she'd promised herself she would be safe. Her eyes burned. The tears came without permission, without the composure that had held everything together for 13 years. They came the way water comes through a hull breach, not slowly, not controlled, but all at once. She pressed her palm against her mouth to muffle the sound. "I can't surface," she whispered. "I can't surface." The words repeated like a prayer or a threat. "I can't surface." The operation was classified. The records were filed under acronyms that no longer existed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had died in Sanjin, and then she had died again in a file room at JSOC, and what remained was supposed to be a ghost, invisible, untraceable, safe. She couldn't surface because the moment she did, everything would be asked of her. Everything she'd buried would be excavated. The Navy Cross would demand explanation. The Bronze Star would demand story. The Purple Heart would demand the wounds that earned it, and wounds like that didn't heal quietly. They bled in front of people. They reminded you that you'd been broken once and survived, and that meant you were the kind of person who had to be broken again to prove it. Her son found her at the kitchen table at 4:51 p.m., his backpack still on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the scene before him, his mother in her work clothes, the termination letter, the tears that his mother never allowed, that she'd trained him never to see. "Mom." His voice had that crack in it that belonged to boys who were still boys, who hadn't learned to hollow themselves out yet. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't tell him that she'd served for 12 years under a rank that officially didn't exist anymore. She couldn't tell him about the 11 Army Rangers she'd carried through fire in a place called Sanjin, or the one she'd held while he bled out on a stone floor, or the way his blood wouldn't come off her hands for months even though she'd scrubbed until her skin split open. She couldn't tell him that the patch sewn inside her old jacket, the faded unit designation from the 75th Ranger Regiment, was the only physical evidence that any of it had been real, that she'd been someone before she became this. "I'm fine," she said. "Just tired." He didn't believe her. He was 14, and he was smart enough to see through mothers who lied for their children's own good, but young enough to respect the lie anyway. He set his backpack down and sat across from her, and they sat in silence while the late afternoon light moved across the table like time passing, like the only thing that ever actually moved. The next morning, the automatic doors at the Navy Exchange slid open and 14-year-old Marcus Ross pushed through carrying a showbox like it weighed more than his entire body. He'd opened it at 3 in the morning after finding it in the back of his mother's closet, buried under winter scarves she hadn't worn since they moved to San Diego. The medals inside had caught the moonlight coming through his bedroom window, and something in him understood instantly that this wasn't the full story. This was the real story. Store Manager Gerald Hawkins stood near the entrance with his morning clipboard, the same clipboard he used to document his fraudulent vendor contracts and mark attendance for employees he was planning to destroy. He saw the boy and moved to intercept him, his hand rising like a gate, but Marcus didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He walked past Hawkins the way soldiers walk past obstacles, and something in that 14-year-old's bearing made the manager hesitate just long enough for the boy to reach the customer service counter. A crowd had already gathered there. The veteran's family had posted Danielle's photograph online the previous evening, a screenshot from the store's internal security camera showing her kneeling in aisle 7 with her hand steady as surgical steel, the hollow pen in her grip, her face utterly calm while an old man's chest was collapsing inward like a dying star. The photo had spread through every military community network in Southern California with a single caption, "Does anyone know this woman? Our father was saved by her at the Navy Exchange on Midway Drive. We need to thank her." Corpsmen shared it. Medics shared it. Veterans groups shared it until it reached the Navy's own internal networks, where people began asking questions about who this woman was and why no one seemed to have a name for her yet. The crowd near the customer service desk was 3 deep now, employees who'd worked with Danielle, customers who'd seen the post, a woman in a blue navy polo who'd come in specifically to find out if the rumors were true. Marcus set the show box on the counter and opened it like he was unveiling something sacred. The metal spilled out with a soft metallic whisper, catching the fluorescent light overhead, and the crowd went perfectly still. Not the absence of sound, the presence of silence, the kind of silence that happens when people suddenly understand they're standing next to something they didn't know existed. A Navy cross. Bronze star with veiler. 2 purple heart ribbons. Marcus's hands were shaking, and that shaking seemed to ripple outward to everyone watching, because this wasn't a story anymore. This was proof. This was real. The customer service manager reached for her phone, and someone behind her whispered, "Oh my God," and in the break room, 2 employees who'd avoided Danielle at lunch for the past 3 days suddenly stopped moving. The doors to the back office opened and Danielle emerged, still wearing yesterday's clothes, still carrying the weight of the firing like a stone in her chest, and when she saw her son standing at that counter with her medal spread in front of him like accusations, her breath stopped. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She moved toward the counter with the same steady precision that had guided the needle between Colin Price's ribs, and her hands reached for the citation stack beside the medals. Her lips moved as she read them, barely audible, the words coming from someplace deeper than her chest. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross received these decorations for actions during a joint operation where she provided combat medical care under sustained enemy fire, saving 11 Army Rangers including Staff Sergeant Colin Price. The name hung in the air like a prayer. Sanjin. 2011, the years that were supposed to stay buried, the life that was supposed to stay dead, suddenly written in official language on government documents that didn't belong to her anymore because she'd signed them away to ghosts. The automatic doors opened again. This time, they didn't slide closed behind the 2 men who entered, as if the building itself understood this moment required witnesses. A Navy captain in dress blues, his ribbon stacked like a wall of achievements, walked alongside a rear admiral whose presence seemed to compress the air itself. The admiral's insignia marked him as someone who commanded a carrier strike group, someone whose voice could move ships and whose decisions reached across oceans. His uniform was immaculate, his eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, and when he stepped into the Navy Exchange and took in the scene, the medals, the crowd, the young boy standing next to a woman who'd been ordered to disappear, something shifted in his face like a vault opening. He moved toward the counter with the captain trailing, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every authority that had ever tried to bury the truth. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross received these decorations for actions during a joint operation where she provided combat medical care under sustained enemy fire, saving 11 Army Rangers including Staff Sergeant Colin Price. He wasn't reading the citation. He was reciting it. He knew these words. He'd carried them since the day his brother came home missing part of his lung and alive because a medic named Ross had kept him breathing through 2 miles of desert under sustained 7.62 rounds. Staff Sergeant Colin Price is my brother. The Admiral let that statement settle like a weight. She pulled him out of Sanjin when his unit was pinned. She carried him for 2,000 meters while enemy fire was trying to kill them both. And she never came home to claim credit for it. 3 FBI agents in windbreakers appeared at the doors before anyone could process what the Admiral had just said. They moved with the economy of motion that came from years of federal training, and the tallest one stepped forward with a document in his hand. Classified records have been unsealed per Department of Defense authorization, he announced, his voice cutting through the growing noise in the store. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross's service record, which was administratively removed from all public databases in 2012, has been restored to full official status effective immediately. The circumstances of that removal are being reviewed by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the Justice Department. He looked directly at Danielle. Your presence is not requested at an interrogation, Senior Chief. This is a notification of reinstatement. Gerald Hawkins still stood near the entrance, his clipboard hanging at his side like a weapon that had suddenly become useless. The Admiral turned to him with the kind of slow precision that comes from the practice of command, and when the Admiral spoke, every person in the Navy Exchange heard it clearly. You fired a decorated Navy SEAL for saving the same man she pulled out of Sanjin 13 years ago. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation that required response. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd already verified everything and found it wanting. You reported her for unauthorized medical practice when she was performing emergency intervention that saved a man's life in 90 seconds. You initiated her termination based on fraudulent complaints about inventory discrepancies that were, in fact, documentation of your own vendor contract manipulation. The Navy Exchange CEO appeared from the administrative corridor as if summoned by gravity itself, and behind him walked 2 NCIS representatives and a JAG officer whose insignia marked him as someone qualified to handle military law. They moved with purpose toward the back office, and Hawkins's face drained of color so completely that he looked like a photograph of himself being slowly erased. Gerald Hawkins, your employment is terminated effective immediately, the CEO said into the silence, and the words landed like a judge's gavel. Termination for fraud, vendor kickback schemes, and wrongful termination of a decorated service member. Your security access is revoked. Your benefits are suspended pending investigation. You will not attempt contact with any Navy Exchange employees or systems. The NCIS representatives escorted Hawkins toward his office, and his phone buzzed once in his pocket with a notification he never would have checked, his email account locked. 30 seconds later, another notification, security access revoked. Then his health insurance terminated. Then a text message from the regional director whose calls he'd made for years, don't call me again. The district managers whose support he'd cultivated through cocktail hours and compliments were suddenly, universally unreachable. The networks he'd spent a decade building crumbled in the time it took for classified records to be unsealed. Danielle stood at the customer service counter with her son on one side and her medals spread across the surface like proof that she'd existed all along. Colin Price's family pushed through the crowd, the old veteran supported between his daughter and grandson, his oxygen tank hissing softly with each labored breath. He moved toward Danielle with the trembling determination of a man trying to hold on to something he'd almost lost forever, and when he reached her, his shaking hands rose to her face. I remember, he said, his voice cracking like old radio static. I was bleeding out and you carried me. 2 miles. I remember your voice telling me to stay with you, stay conscious, keep your eyes open. Tears streamed down his weathered face, and he pulled up his sleeve to show the tattoo on his forearm, her name, Ross, written in dark ink with the Ranger insignia beneath it. I got this when I got home. Even when I couldn't remember my own daughter's name, I remembered you. Marcus moved beside his mother, and for the first time since she'd been fired, since she'd sat at the kitchen table whispering I can't surface, Danielle let her son see her clearly. Not as a grocery store employee. Not as a nurse without credentials. But as a senior chief petty officer, a decorated combat medic, a woman who'd carried a man through enemy fire and never told anyone about it because the record said she'd never existed. A woman who'd chosen invisibility to protect something larger than herself, and whose 14-year-old son was finally seeing that his mother hadn't been hiding. She'd been standing guard. The Admiral removed his navy jacket and draped it across her shoulders, the Senior Chief anchor insignia catching the light. "Welcome back, Senior Chief," he said quietly. "Naval Medical Center San Diego is expecting you as a medical officer. Full rank restoration. Your choice on when you report." He paused, and something almost like a smile crossed his face. "My brother's been telling everyone in his veterans group that his rescuer was a myth. A story. A woman who didn't really exist." The Admiral looked at Colin Price, at Marcus, at the crowd bearing witness. Time to prove him wrong. The next 6 months moved like a story that had finally been allowed to be told. Danielle reported to Naval Medical Center San Diego in dress blues with her ribbons arranged in proper order, the Navy Cross positioned exactly where it belonged, above the Bronze Star with Valor and the Purple Hearts. She taught combat medicine seminars to corpsmen preparing for deployment, and when a young enlisted asked how she'd stayed composed during the worst moments in San Jin, she said, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Her son helped her hang her medals in their living room above the framed jacket with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch, the patch Colin Price's unit had given her with a plaque that read, "To Senior Chief Ross, you brought our brother home." Gerald Hawkins still sits at a folding table outside a discount grocery store in East San Diego, selling low-cost insurance policies to people who don't know his name. He ages a little more with each passing day, his contacts list empty, his references unusable, his certification under permanent review. When Danielle walks past on her way to the hospital in her Navy Medical Corps uniform, their eyes meet for exactly 1 second, and she doesn't acknowledge him because some people aren't owed your voice. At the Navy Exchange, they frame a photograph in the employee break room, Danielle in dress blues receiving a commendation from the Admiral, her son standing beside her, both of them smiling. The caption reads, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Navy SEAL Combat Medic, 2011 present." Below it, someone has written in careful letters, "Just a nurse?" Never. The night shift reads it and understands. The morning crew reads it and remembers. And the groceries are always perfectly stocked because the woman who restocks them is no longer invisible. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.